In May, I sat down with Tony Payan, director of our Center for the U.S. Mexico, to talk about the broad challenges facing Mexico and the U.S. Mexico relationship under Presidents Claudia Sheinbaum and Donald Trump. We released part one of that conversation last week, focusing on Mexico's domestic policy in particular. Here's the second and final part of that conversation. Tony and I explore the issue of organized crime and the fentanyl trade, perhaps the thorniest issue in the binational relationship, and Trump's executive order designating cartels as terrorists. Immigration and border crossings, the future of the U.S. trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, and water scarcity, which is increasingly impacting farmers and supply chains along the border, including in South Texas. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. One of the most critical relationships the United States has in the world, from a national interest, national security, and certainly commercial, industrial, economic, trade reason, that with Mexico. New President of the United States, Donald Trump. New President of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum. Relationships, personal relationships, are very important to this administration and to this U.S. president. Let's talk about how President Sheinbaum has been handling that critical personal relationship, as well as the substance of where the U.S. Mexican relationship stands today.
Yes, I think at this point, what we can say about Claudia Sheinbaum is that she has been non-confrontational and avoidant of any conflict. When President Trump announced tariffs against Mexico, and currently Mexico is paying, I think, the flat 10% on everything and then 25% on certain things that had been imposed before. So Mexico is actually a target of the Trump administration, essentially being affected by tariffs. And the president has not responded with equivalent tariffs. Unlike Canada or Europe or other countries that have done the same thing, Mexico has simply said, we'll just absorb the shock and avoid a confrontation with Donald Trump. I think President Sheinbaum understands that Mexico is extremely vulnerable to almost any action by the Trump administration, and she has chosen to placate him. Now, domestically, I think she quietly, nicely, in the morning press conferences, asks for explanations, which are not given. She says that she is in dialogue with the Trump administration. I doubt that very much. I don't think there is anyone in the Sheinbaum administration that has a very good relationship with the Trump White House. I don't think the ambassador, Mr. Moctezuma, in Washington has an in with the Trump administration. I don't think anybody in the cabinet or the Sheinbaum administration has an in with the Trump administration. I don't see any strong relationships there. I think essentially she's managing it by simply going around it and not adopting a confrontational style. And so far, it seems to have worked. Tariffs are there. Mexico is paying to some extent economically for them, but she certainly doesn't want to fight with Trump.
Let's turn that question in a slightly different direction. Are there advantages to Claudia Sheinbaum and her establishing her own position as president, as an authority in her own right, from managing the relationship with the United States? Does she help herself in Mexico on critical issues by using President Trump and the relationship?
Certainly. I think one of the things that she has done is essentially used what many Mexicans see as an aggression from the United States to her advantage. She has about an 83-85% popularity rating. I think Mr. Trump has certainly helped many foreign leaders, the Liberal Party in Canada and on, and I think it's helped the president in Mexico. Mexicans have sort of rallied around the flag, so to speak, and therefore supported the president. The president has certainly avoided any conflict and used what I think many Mexicans see as an aggressive Washington to use a sovereignty-focused rhetoric. Mexico, we're sovereign, we make our own decisions. We certainly ask for explanations and on every morning, softly though, and that's worked for her. So far, she seems to have the support of the Mexican people in her approach to the Trump administration.
Let's talk about the substance of some of the critical issues in discussion. I'll start with security, organized crime, the cartels, and fentanyl, of course. In recent days, the president has proposed again sending American troops into Mexico to assist the Sheinbaum administration in combating the drug cartels. She's rejected this. Tell me how this posture, or rhetorical posture on the part of the U.S. administration, the president, actually has impacted in terms of the substance of security, governmental control over some of the areas of Mexico in the hands of the cartels and the issue of fentanyl? Where's it going?
Yes, I think this is probably the thorniest issue in the binational relationship under the Trump administration. It has for a very long time been recognized that Mexico represents a serious public safety and security problem for the United States. Most administrations, though, have handled that carefully, gingerly, sort of trying to deal with the Mexican government, establish accords. We may remember the 2007 through 2020, about 13 years of the Merida Initiative. Funds were provided, people were extradited. Some joint operations took place at that time. I think the Trump administration has no patience for that. They definitely don't have the willingness to go and be tolerant of an approach that is binational. The Trump administration was very clear, and it has actually taken very specific measures to deal with what is known as narco politics in Mexico. And I mean organized crime. I mean the collaboration between functionaries in government and politicians in Mexico who are in collusion with the organized criminal elements in Mexico. Some of those measures are really impactful and really important. One of them, of course, was the president's decree or executive order, whatever you want to call it, designated Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations. That has really had an impact because it means that anybody, companies, individuals, politicians, functionaries in Mexico that in any way collude with organized crime, aid and abet organized crime, facilitate it, tolerate it, or even collaborate with them openly by being members who ran for office or by laundering money and helping that, are now the target of the U.S. government.
And this includes elected officials.
Correct. In fact, earlier in April, it was announced that the mayor of Matamoros had been revoked his visa. He can no longer cross into the United States because he's a target of investigations under the FTO, the
Foreign Terrorist Organization.
Exactly. And now, an unprecedented move, the governor of Baja California, Marina del Pilar Avila, has been revoked the visa. This is the first time ever that a Mexican governor has been accused of collaborating with organized crime, and her visa and her husband's visa have been taken away. And just yesterday, the governor of Tamaulipas, Américo Villarreal, and his whole family were taking their visas away.
And what is Sheinbaum's reaction to this? Does this help her?
Not really. This is where it gets really tricky for her because obviously the media are asking her about what are the reasons why the United States withdrew these particular visas from these politicians. In the very beginning, I think she defended the governor of Baja California, Marina del Pilar Avila. She said that she stood by her party's governors. But a couple of days ago, in the morning press conference, she named her as a target of the U.S. government, but not by name. That was read in Mexico as essentially President Sheinbaum putting distance between her and Marina del Pilar Avila, the governor of Baja California. We'll see how she responds to Américo Villarreal, another mayor in Badiraguato, which is a cradle of organized crime in Mexico. His visa has been taken away. I think what the president's executive order on FTOs has done is essentially broaden the reach of the U.S. government and provided a series of tools from the Treasury Department, the State Department, the Homeland Security Department, and I think the Justice Department, the DA specifically, to begin to sort of map out all the different interconnections, that networks of politicians and organized crime in Mexico, and begin to target them one by one. And this is where the president, I think, is in a bind because there has been for a long time an understanding that the López Obrador administration, López Obrador was her mentor. He handpicked her to be his successor, essentially created a political coalition with organized crime in Mexico. Well, that's not tolerable to the United States anymore, and President Trump is asking for specific operations on the ground, withdrawing visas, being a lot more aggressive. Most Mexicans know and understand that intuitively. They know that there's some collusion between government, the Morena party, and governors and mayors. And now this is coming home to roost. And the president is in a bind because will she defend the Morena individuals who've been targeted by the United States, or will she say it's time to clean house?
Tony, migration. In April of 2025, illegal border crossings from Mexico into the U.S. dropped to under 10,000. That was a 93% decrease from April 24 and it's among the lowest monthly totals in 25 years. Now, this has followed aggressive enforcement measures, troop deployments on the U.S. side, tightening dramatically how asylum is interpreted and implemented. And Mexico has also stepped up enforcement along its southern border. How can President Trump capitalize positively on the diminution, if not removal, of this highly sensitive issue from the bilateral equation?
Yeah, this is a really important issue. Obviously, it's been pestering the binational relationship at least since 2012, I think, when we saw the first caravans of migrants, thousands of them marching on foot or on top of trains through Mexico coming to the border. And I think the Obama administration struggled with it. I think the first Trump administration struggled with it up and down. The numbers went up and down quite a bit, depending on the actions. And of course, Biden struggled quite a bit, and it cost him quite a bit. The major objective of the U.S. was essentially to get Mexico to stem the flow of immigrants. And Mexico has taken very specific rules. It imposed visa requirements on many nationalities so that they couldn't easily come into Mexico. It certainly has been detaining a lot of migrants in the state of Chiapas. There are still many of them stranded in that state, and it has accelerated deportations. In fact, in some months, I think Mexico has deported more people than the United States itself. I've been to Juarez recently. We had an immigration event in Juarez across from El Paso, Texas, and I can tell you that there were 32 shelters. There's now one with about 25 migrants. So it's certainly dropped. I think the temptation for the Trump administration is that in the absence of a real problem at the border that can be used politically and strong action by Mexico to end that problem for the United States so as not to provoke any additional measures from Washington is to turn inwards and to begin to sort of create some chaos on immigration, but not at the border within the United States. And we've seen Mr. Trump going after permanent residents and things like that.
Tony, one of the metrics to see whether a counter-illicit migration policy is effective is whether you're deterring point of origin criminal traffickers. That is, the inability to deliver their cargo, their human cargo, successfully across, in this case, Mexico, and in this case, into the United States. Over time, word gets back. And those who would use at high price, human and financial price, these traffickers cease to do it because they're not going to get there. Are there indications now that this is reaching back to points of origin, that the press, it's not just turnaways at the border of Mexico, that the generating forces here to move those people to the southern border or to airports in Mexico is diminishing?
Absolutely, and I'll tell you why. Because if you look at the president's executive order on FTOs, one of the lines is very clear. Anybody that smuggles people to the United States, anybody that facilitates entering the United States without documents is also subject to this executive order and can be accused not of being a coyote, a smuggler, or even a criminal. They're now a national security threat. So by the inclusion of all these individuals that used to be engaged in human smuggling, not human trafficking, that's obviously a big issue, but human smuggling, just essentially the coyotes that facilitated people, recruited people, moved them across the border, they're now terrorists. They're now designated terrorists. And so I think many of them are going to think twice because the penalties, if I read the document correctly, can be anywhere between 10 and 20 years in federal prison in the United States, just for being a coyote.
The USMCA, that is the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, is scheduled for a mandatory review and potential renegotiation in 2026 under its sunset clause. That's a Trump 1 administration product. In early 2025, as you've noted before, all of our listeners will know President Trump imposed tariffs on several categories of exports. The tariffs contradict the USMCA's core principles. The president's authority cited to do this was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and his declaration of a national emergency because of the impact of foreign imports on U.S. security interests. What is the future of the agreement? What's going to happen in the prep of this year and in the execution of the review next year, Tony? Use your crystal ball.
Yes, President Trump, I think, has said just a few days ago that he wondered whether the agreement was needed at all any longer. So he certainly put the very existence of the agreement on the table. My guess is that President Trump has now entered a stage in which he's eager, given the economic consequences that his policies on trade have had for the country, to conclude agreements with other countries. They're going to be uneven. They're going to be depending on the country. There's not going to be a multilateral negotiation with equal treatment. It's going to be a lot of individual agreements and almost individual treatment. This is where Canada and Mexico, I think, could probably bind together and try to negotiate together with Washington a North American deal. Or Canadians could simply say, we want a deal directly Ottawa, Washington, and leaving Mexico out. And then Mexico will have to say, well, we want a Mexico City-Washington agreement. So this is going to be an important moment for the North American project, the North American idea. But I think the Trump administration will probably revive the agreement. It will be renegotiated. I think there's some idea that for the U.S. to be competitive with China, it needs these floaters, say Mexico and Canada. It needs them integrated to the American economy. There's value to that. I think the value of the NAFTA agreement, the USMCA agreement, is demonstrated historically, and I think Washington will come around. What the content will be, what chapters will be changed or added or taken away, I think that's where the real questions are going to be. The president has to inform Congress 270 days before, by October 1st of this year, whether he intends to end it or renegotiate it. Now, remember, if the president says, we want to end it, there won't be a renegotiation, the agreement is still extant for an additional 10 years. So the next president can come and say, we want to renegotiate it and keep it alive.
Yeah, Tony, here at the Institute, we're strong believers in laws of gravity. That is, certain evidence-based, experience-based consequences. One of those is the inability to unscramble an egg. The integration of the Mexican, Canadian, and U.S. economies, industrial sectors, the intra-firm trade that consumers never see, where a firm trades pieces of things back and forth multiple times across multiple international boundaries, is so much a part of the U.S. consumer economy and industrial base that you can't disassociate them now. That would argue that revisions, yes, but upsetting the entire NAFTA, then USMCA structures, you can't go back. Do you agree?
I agree with it. I think at the end, there's going to be a realization in the United States that Mexico and Canada are an essential part of the North American platform, that the United States needs them as much as they obviously need the United States, that it's advantageous to integrate our economies and to come together into a more competitive platform. That's why I think the agreement will survive. Also, the other thing is, even if you were to go to the molecular level and try to unscramble the egg, you still will take a very long time to do it at that level. So I think the Trump administration will conclude in 3.5 years or so. It will also depend on what happens in 26 with the midterm elections in the United States. And I think the next president may simply choose that this is a necessary thing, which I think there'll be a recognition of, and the agreement will survive.
Water. Tony, can you clarify for the listeners what has happened on the issue of the water debt and the 1944 U.S. Mexico treaty that governs that debt?
Yes, the 1944 agreement on water sharing between the two countries is essentially two agreements in one. On the one hand, the United States provides from the Colorado Rivershed water to Mexico in Baja California, Sonora on the west. And Mexico is supposed to provide in return water to Texas from the northeastern region of Mexico, the states of Chihuahua, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas, which are the states that border Texas. The U.S. has fulfilled its commitment to Mexico and delivered water every year, despite a very serious drought in the southwest of the United States and the 7 states that share that watershed, California, Arizona, and on and on. Mexico has really stuttered in the delivery. Every 5 years, Mexico has delivered that much water. I think it's 1.75 million acre feet of water.
This is when the water debt has to settle.
Every
5 years.
That's right. And presumably, the balance has to be brought to zero. For Texans, and Texans are very much involved in this, the water should be delivered in regular payments every year so that Texas farmers and ranchers and cities can plan on that water. Mexico often doesn't deliver until the last year, and then there's all the water all of a sudden. I think that's an issue, and Texans are having an issue with that. Mexico could potentially, I think the agreement provides, under extraordinary conditions, the ability for Mexico to carry over some balance from one quinquennial to the next quinquennial. Mexico has generally paid every year a little bit and then made a push at the end. It's not satisfactory to Texans, but it's paid. This quinquennial that ends in October of 25 is the first quinquennial where Mexico fell in arrears in water deliveries. I think at the end of last year, Mexico had paid about 20%, about a fifth of all the water, making Texans very mad because all of a sudden Mexico is going to have to scramble, and I think Sheinbaum is already doing it, going into the states of Coahuila and Tamaulipas and Nuevo León and emptying the dams in those states to deliver the water to Texas. But that's not useful to Texas.
Tony, will they do so?
I think she will make a push. But here's another one of those ticking time bombs that we didn't talk about at that time that's sitting under the chair of the president in Mexico. I think that she's going to get many of the farmers and ranchers, cattle people in those states, which are very heavy on that. We saw that 5 years ago, President López Obrador had to deliver the water, and there were guns drawn, and there were people killed in the state of Chihuahua to deliver the water, because they were opposed to emptying the dams and letting them off into the river up to the Rio Grande so that Texas could take the water. I think Sheinbaum has a crisis, has a political problem. She's going to have to starve the ranchers and farmers in those northern states to deliver the water to Texas. The Texans will not be happy because they're getting all the water at once at the last minute. That's not useful for any kind of planning. And the Mexicans are not going to be happy because they're not going to have the water that they need. So Sheinbaum is going to have to deal with that.
What has she said about this issue to date?
She said that Mexico will fulfill its promise. It will deliver the water. In the last few weeks, we have actually seen that she's taken action, but she's having the National Guard go over to those dams, kind of seal the area and open the gates, the floodgates, to let the water through to the river. But I think the ranchers and farmers are really, really mad.
Tony, fascinating and extremely important issues, all of them. And we will be discussing these and other questions as they arise over the time ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think for the listeners, I don't think there is any other country that has more issues so thorny and so consequential for all of us in the U.S. and Texas than Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Tony and our other experts at the Center for the U.S. and Mexico closely follow all of the issues touched on in this conversation and more. Each year, they publish the Mexico Country Outlook Report, an in-depth analysis of the key challenges facing Mexico and the U.S. Mexico relationship. The report is presented at our annual Mexico Country Outlook Conference, which will take place this year on October 16. Attendees will get an early look at our report for 2026, which will be released in November, and provide an important resource for industry, policymakers, and media looking to understand what's ahead. You can learn how to attend at bakerinstitute.org/MCO. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thanks for listening.